Madam President, at long last today we have received the President's budget. It's several weeks, actually months overdue. It was supposed to have been out on February the 4th. It's generally used to steer or guide the budget debate that we have here in Washington, D.C. But in this case, it's going to be a reaction to, it's going to be after the fact, the discussion of the budget, because the House and the Senate have both passed budgets. The Senate, for the first time in 4 years, the House has passed their budget every year on time. And so you would hope at least that the President's budget would serve as a bridge between the House and the Senate, perhaps, at this point in the process, since because it is so much after the fact, so late in the game, that the President's budget has come to us. But regrettably, much of the budget, the President's budget, is going to rely on the same formula that the Senate Democrat budget did, and that is to double down, to increase spending, to significantly, substantially raise taxes, and to add massive amounts to the debt. And it never balances. Now, the budget that was passed by the House of Representatives did balance. It balanced in 10 years. The budget that was passed by the United States Senate did not balance, only in 10 years, but it never balanced. And so you had a real contrast in terms of trying to get to a balanced budget over a period of time, knowing full well that it's not going to happen overnight. We got into a very big hole. It took a long while to get into this hole. It's going to take us a little while to get out. But nevertheless, the House budget at least did balance in a 10-year window, 10-year time frame. The Senate Democrat budget never balances, and nor does the budget that we received this morning from the President. Now, it's important, I think, for a lot of reasons, this budget debate is, not the least of which is, it is a vision, if you will, a blueprint for the future of the country, for each of the respective parties here in the Congress, as well as the President, about where they want to lead the country. And I mentioned yesterday on the floor that I thought the basic criteria that should be used to evaluate a budget, the question that ought to be asked, is what will this budget do to grow the economy, to create jobs, and to increase the take-home pay of middle-class Americans? What can we do, in other words, in terms of a budget process here and a budget itself that actually would take us in a direction that would get more Americans working and get the economy growing and expanding again, which makes these fiscal issues look much smaller by comparison. And I say that because last week we got some employment data, statistics that came out. The unemployment rate as a percentage actually dropped to 7.6%, but only because another 500,000 people quit looking for work. And so if you look at the real unemployment rate, and that is you include the people who actually have stopped looking for work, people who are working part-time because they can't find full-time employment, the actual unemployment rate is 13.8%. And that's 21.7 million Americans. That's how many people who are either out of work, have quit looking for work, or are working part-time simply because they can't find full-time employment. That is a lot of people. That is a big part of our economy. A lot of folks are out of the workforce today who couldn't find jobs, and many have actually just given up looking for jobs. And what that's done, because there are so many Americans who in frustration have given up looking for jobs, it has lowered the labor participation rate to a rate that we haven't seen literally since 1979. The last time the labor participation rate was at the low level that we saw in the month of March, 63.3%, was 1979. And in fact, Madam President, if you had a labor participation rate that was equal to what it was when the President took office in January of 2009, the unemployment rate today would not be 7.6%, it would be 11%. That's how many people have quit looking for work as a result of this slow and sluggish economy. And so the President's budget, you would hope, would try and answer in an affirmative way the question, does this grow the economy? Does this create jobs? Does this increase the take-home pay of working Americans? But unfortunately, rather than growing the economy, the President's budget instead grows the government. And that's unfortunately what we have seen in the budget that was passed by the United States Senate a couple of weeks ago. And again, just by way of contrast, and I say this simply because I think there are two very different ideas about how to solve the fiscal crisis that we face in this country, one of which includes expanding and growing government and raising taxes, adding even more and more to the debt, one that really focuses on the issue that what plagues our fiscal house here in Washington, D.C. isn't that we tax too little, it's that we spend too much. And it really goes after the spending problem that we have in Washington, D.C., the addiction to spending, which we've seen as a percentage of our economy grow consistently over the past several years since this president has been in office. And so the House budget recognized that, does balance in 10 years, does it without increasing taxes. The House of Representatives actually produced a budget that balances in 10 years, doesn't raise taxes, in fact calls for tax reform, which many of us believe would do wonders in terms of unleashing economic growth in this country by getting rates down, reducing the rates, and broadening the tax base. But it also takes on what really drives federal spending, what really contributes to the debt crisis that we have in this country, and that's runaway spending, particularly in certain areas of the budget. The area of the budget that we call mandatory spending. It's that part of the budget that's sort of on autopilot, and it includes entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and right now that represents about 3/5 of all federal spending. At the end of the 10-year window, it will represent 91% of all federal spending. That's how fast those programs are growing, 2 to 3 times the rate of inflation. Well, the president's budget doesn't do anything significant or meaningful to address that crisis. It's just flat not serious. Now, having said that, there were some what I would call incremental steps taken. I call them baby steps. The president agreed in his budget to address the issue of chain CPI, which recalculates the formula by which benefits under certain government programs are calculated, achieves a certain level of savings over a period of time. They assume some savings in Medicare, most of which, again, are by reducing payments to providers. We've already cut payments to providers to the point that many physicians and other healthcare providers these days are getting to where they're saying, I'm not going to serve Medicaid or Medicare patients because we keep cutting those reimbursements. That's not the way that you save and protect these programs for future generations. You have to restructure and reform these programs in a way that aligns those programs with the future demographics of this country. And unfortunately, the president's budget fails on that count. Now, let me just say that in terms of the direction that these various budgets head, the Senate Democrat budget, because it didn't balance in 10 years, nor does the president's, both use similar assumptions, I guess you could say, about spending. In fact, if you look at the new debt that's piled up by the president's budget, he adds $8.2 trillion to the debt over the next decade. The Senate Democrat budget added $7.3 trillion to the debt over the next decade. And both have net spending increases. The spending amount over the 10-year period in both the president's budget proposal and the Senate Democrat budget proposal is on the order of $46.5 trillion. That's the amount of money, amount of taxpayer money that the federal government would spend over the next decade under the budgets proposed by the president and the Senate Democrats. The House budget, passed largely by the House Republicans, spends about $5 trillion less than that over that same time period. How does it do that? Well, by reducing the rate of growth of federal spending. If you limit the rate of growth in federal spending to 3.4% as opposed to a 4.6% number in the Senate Democrat budget, or the 5.2% increase in mandatory spending called for in the president's budget, you achieve significant savings over a period of time. And you're not cutting government, you are simply slowing the rate of growth. By growing government at a slower rate, and getting it back into a more reasonable level, you can actually achieve $5 trillion in savings over the next decade in terms of what the federal government was spent. And that's the way that the House approached their budget. What the Senate Democrats and the President have both done is called for massive new tax increases. In fact, the only deficit reduction that will occur under the President's budget will be because of tax increases, because he wipes out the $1.2 trillion in spending cuts that were in place as a result of the sequester. He replaces those and achieve somewhere on the order of $600 billion in deficit reduction, but that deficit reduction would be entirely accomplished by tax increases, raising taxes yet again. After we've had tax increases, both on the fiscal cliff on January 1st, the President got a huge tax increase, something that he had been wanting for a long time, $620 billion in new taxes. You add that to the more than $1 trillion in new taxes that are in the Obamacare bill passed a couple of years ago, and this President, on his watch, has signed into law more than $1.7 trillion in new taxes. So this is not a revenue problem, Madam President. This is a spending problem. And what we need to be focused on here is what are we going to do to rein in out-of-control federal spending? How are we going to reform and restructure these programs in a way that protects and saves them, not only for people who depend upon them today, but for those who are going to need them in the future? That's really the question before the House. And so as we receive the President's budget today, and again, as I said earlier, it'll be the latest point at which the President has submitted a budget, literally, I think since around, it's been 100 years, let's put it that way. It's been around the early 1900s was the last time that the President submitted his budget to this Congress at this late date. And again, having already acted here in the House and the Senate, I'm not sure what meaning it has other than to perhaps give the President the luxury to be able to say he actually at least presented a budget. But on most of the criteria, I guess, in terms of evaluating this budget that I mentioned earlier we ought to be looking at, it is not a serious attempt. It doesn't do anything to rein in these out-of-control programs that are growing at 2 to 3 times the rate of inflation. It has a massive tax increase, a $1 trillion tax increase on top of the $1.7 trillion in new taxes that the President has already signed into law. It adds $8.2 trillion to the debt over the next decade. And so for that reason, Madam President, I think it fails the fundamental test of fiscal responsibility, but more importantly, perhaps even than that, it fails to answer the question that I posed earlier, and that is, does the President's budget grow the economy, does it create jobs, and does it increase take-home pay for middle-income Americans? The answer to that simply is no, because when you're raising taxes, consistently raising taxes on the people who create the jobs in our economy, it just makes the economy grow at a slower rate. You have more sluggish growth, which is what we've seen now for the past several years. When we're growing at 1.5% to 2% as opposed to 3 to 4%, it makes a huge difference in terms of the number of people in this country that are employed, the number of jobs that are created, and obviously it makes a huge difference in terms of the fiscal imbalance, because when the economy is growing at a faster rate, it means more people are working, more people are investing, and therefore making money and paying taxes. And so tax revenues go up when the economy is growing and expanding. That ought to be the goal. That ought to be our goal, not only to get those 21.7 million Americans who are out of work back to work, but also to get the fiscal imbalance that we face in this country in a more manageable place. And if we're going to get our fiscal house in order, we have to do those two things. We have got to restrain federal spending, and we have got to put policies in place that grow the economy. And there is a relationship between the two. It's been well documented, well studied, well researched that when you have spending that's out of control, when you have a debt as a percentage of your GDP that exceeds a certain level, that it harms economic growth. It reduces the amount the economy grows on an annual basis, and in so doing also reduces the number of jobs that are created. And so this is the question that should be asked. And again, when you compare or stack up the President's budget against that question, does it grow the economy? Does it create jobs? Does it increase the take-home pay for middle-class Americans? The answer is simply no. And I would compare again with the legislation that was passed, the budget that was passed by both the House and the Senate. In the case of the Senate, studies done that suggested that it would cost 800,000 jobs a year, again, because of the tax increases that are included, the higher level of federal spending. Simply raising taxes to fuel yet more federal spending does nothing to grow the private economy. What we want to see is a smaller federal economy and a bigger private economy where the real good-paying jobs are created. And that's clearly, again, with this budget, which relies heavily, which doubles down on federal spending, adds more to the debt, doesn't achieve balance, increases taxes by $1 trillion, takes us in absolutely the wrong direction. And I hope that before this is all said and done, that the House and Representatives and the Senate, both of which have passed budgets, and now we have the President's budget, can somehow sit down together and figure out how we get a proposal that actually would deal with out-of-control spending and would focus on growing the economy, creating jobs, and increasing the take-home pay for middle-class Americans. That ought to be the criteria that we use, and I would hope, Madam President, before this is all said and done, that people here in the city would realize that we don't have a taxing problem. The problem here isn't that we tax too little, it's that we spend too much, and that's what needs to be addressed. And so I hope that we can reconcile these budgets, but it's going to require the President to be engaged on a level that he hasn't demonstrated so far, that he gets what this real issue is and wants to get serious about reining in out-of-control government spending. So, Madam President, I hope that we can make some headway there yet. I've not lost hope, and as I said, there were some incremental gains, some baby steps that the President took in this, but it's far short of what needs to be done to get our economy back on track and to get government spending under control. Madam President, I yield the floor.